Whose children are these? Not mine. Run the test again. He denied his own children before he ever held them. Before Nikisha could even wipe the sweat from her face. The manila folder landed on the hospital bed with a sharp, deliberate slap. DNA test results stamped across the front in bold black ink. One hard corner caught the back of Nikisha's hand as she instinctively flinched. She barely felt it. They are not mine. Daehyun's voice did not rise. It never did. That was the most terrifying thing about him. His coldest moments were always the quietest ones. He stood at the foot of her bed in a suit that cost more than most people's monthly salary, tattoos crawling up the column of his throat, jaw set like a closed vault. He did not ask if she was okay. He did not look at the babies. 3 of them were pressed against Nikisha's chest, warm, small, and possibly new. The 4th was down the hall in the NICU, fighting in the way only the tiniest humans know how to fight. 22 hours of labor. A hemorrhage they nearly didn't stop. And this was what waited for her on the other side. Daehyun. Her voice cracked on his name. Just his name. She had nothing else. He took a single step back, like she had reached for him with something unclean. His expression did not change. That blankness, she used to think it meant he was calm. Now she understood. It meant he had already decided. Behind him stood Madame Yoon, arms folded across her chest, chin lifted at an angle that had always made Nikisha feel like she was being measured for a coffin. The older woman's eyes moved slowly from Nikisha's face to the baby's, then back, and what lived in that gaze was not cruelty exactly. It was something older and colder than cruelty. It was certainty. The certainty of a woman who had been waiting 3 years for this exact moment to arrive. A black woman carrying the heir to the Black Dragon Consortium, Madame Yoon said softly, almost to herself. The gentleness of her tone made it worse. I told him from the beginning. I told him what you were. He simply needed time to see it for himself. Beside her, slightly behind, always watching from a careful distance, stood Sarah. Polished. Till. The ghost of a smile on her mouth that she had the discipline not to let fully form. She said nothing. She didn't need to. The work was already done. Keisha looked at all 3 of them. Then she looked down at her babies. And something inside her chest broke open, quietly, completely, and in the breaking something else was born. Something that did not weep or plead or shrink. Something that had been waiting underneath the love and the patience and the years of making herself smaller so he could feel larger. She said nothing. That silence, absolute, unreadable, almost serene, was the thing that finally made Daehyun's eyes shift. Just once. Just a flicker. He didn't understand it yet. None of them did. But Nikisha Salim had just made a decision. Besties, before we go back to where this all started, let me ask you something. Have you subscribed to the channel? If not, please do. It helps this community grow, and drop in the comments where you're watching from. It means everything. Now, let's go back to the beginning. The hotel bathroom tiles were cold the first night she followed him to Seoul. Nikisha sat on the marble floor, back against the wall of a 5-star suite she had no business being in, staring at a man she had known for exactly 11 days, who was already looking at her like she was a problem he needed to solve and a secret he didn't want to give up. You shouldn't be here, Daehyun said from the doorway. His jacket was off. For the first time, she could see the full geography of the tattoos, black dragon scales and Korean script climbing from his wrist to his collarbone. He looked like he had been built for intimidation and had simply forgotten to turn it off around her. You invited me, Nikisha said. I know. A pause. That's the problem. She was a forensic accountant. She had been hired by a front company, 3 layers of shell corporations deep, to audit financial irregularities in a Gangnam real estate portfolio. She was supposed to find discrepancies and leave. She was not supposed to find Daehyun at the center of everything, watching her work from across a boardroom with an expression she couldn't name. She was not supposed to stay. But she did. For 3 years she stayed. She became his wife in a ceremony that 3 people attended. She learned to move through his world, quiet, careful, brilliant, invisible. She told herself the invisibility was temporary. She told herself he saw her, even when the world around him didn't. She told herself a lot of things. Then the power grew. And the man who once pressed his lips to her temple before dawn became someone who looked through her at dinner parties, who suggested, carefully at first and then plainly, that she straighten her hair for consortium gatherings, that her presence needed to be managed, that she needed to fit the frame his world required. She had started to bend. That was her flaw, not weakness, but love so complete it made her willing to become less so he could become more. Then came Sarah. She entered the consortium's orbit 6 months before the pregnancy, sharp and connected and utterly purposeful. She did not want Daehyun the man. She wanted the throne beneath him. And the fastest route to it was dismantling the one person whose loyalty to him was still absolute, because a man who doubts his wife doubts his own judgment, and a man who doubts his judgment can be guided. Sarah was very good at guiding. So the whispers began. Carefully, patiently, planted in the spaces between Daehyun's pride and his paranoia, watered by Madame Yoon's ancient disdain. And when the ultrasound technician went very still and then pointed to the screen, 4 distinct heartbeats for small shadows moving in the dark, Nikisha felt a joy so enormous it almost broke her open. She didn't see the look that crossed Daehyun's face. She should have looked. When she finally became fully pregnant, visibly, undeniably, the whispers became accusations. And Daehyun, who had survived Seoul's underworld by trusting no one, found it remarkably easy to stop trusting her. The DNA test was Madame Yoon's idea. Framed as procedure. Framed as protection for the bloodline. Nikisha agreed. She had nothing to hide. She did not yet know what the results would reveal. Not just about her children, but about him. His name wasn't supposed to be anywhere near that audit. Nikisha had been hired by a Singapore-registered holding company to trace irregularities in a Gangnam real estate portfolio, 3 shell corporations deep, clean on the surface and rotting quietly underneath. Standard work for someone with her skills. Find the leak, write the report, collect the fee, leave. She had done it a dozen times in a dozen cities. She was good at finding things people buried. She was not prepared to find him. Daehyun appeared in the documentation as a ghost, a signature that technically belonged to a subsidiary director who, upon investigation, had been dead for 4 years. Someone was using a dead man's name to move money. Nikisha flagged it on a Tuesday afternoon, and by Wednesday morning, a man in a black suit was standing in the doorway of her temporary office with 2 cups of coffee and an expression that said he already knew everything she had found. "You're thorough," he said. Not a question. "You're early," she replied. "I wasn't expecting whoever sent you until Friday." "I don't send people," Daehyun said. "I come myself." He set 1 cup on her desk. He did not sit down until she gestured that he could. That small thing, waiting for permission in a room he almost certainly owned, was what disarmed her first. She should have walked away. Everything she knew about forensic work said, When the client shows up in person before the report is finished, the report is never the point. But Daehyun sat across from her for 2 hours asking questions that had nothing to do with the audit. About her work, her methods, what she looked for when the numbers didn't lie but the structure did, and he listened the way people rarely listen. Like the answer actually mattered. She stayed 3 weeks longer than the job required. By the time she understood who he really was, what the Black Dragon Consortium was, what his name meant in the architecture of Seoul's shadow economy, she was already in love with the man who existed before the title. The man who called her at midnight to ask if she had eaten. Who learned how she took her coffee without asking twice. Who looked at her like she was the most interesting problem he had ever encountered and had no intention of solving her, only knowing her. They married in January. A civil ceremony. 3 witnesses, her cousin Amara, his attorney, and a judge who was owed a favor. No announcement. No reception. No photographs in any publication. His world did not need to know, he said. What matters is that we know. She believed him. 6 weeks later, Madame Yoon appeared at their apartment door for what Daehyun called a family dinner. She stood in Nikisha's kitchen and looked at her, slowly, completely, the way you assess something you are deciding whether to tolerate or remove, and then she smiled. It was the most dangerous smile Nikisha had ever seen. She just didn't know it yet. It didn't happen all at once. That was the thing nobody tells you about losing someone who is still standing in the room. It happens in increments so small you almost convince yourself you imagined each one. The first thing to go was the mornings. He used to wake before her and lie there anyway, just existing in the quiet beside her, one hand resting on her back like she was something he wanted to keep finding. Then the consortium's expansion into 3 new provinces happened, and the mornings became phone calls, and the phone calls became the first thing he reached for when he opened his eyes. She told herself it was temporary. Ambition has seasons. She would wait for the next one. The second thing to go was his attention at dinner. Not suddenly. First it was distraction. His eyes moving to his phone, his answers arriving half a beat late, his mind already somewhere across the city solving problems she wasn't cleared to know about. She learned to carry the conversation alone. She got very good at it. She told herself this was what it meant to love someone with a large life. You make room. You adjust. Then came the comments. Small ones at first, delivered gently, almost as suggestions. The consortium wives tend to wear their hair a certain way at these events. It might be easier for you. She looked at him for a long moment and said nothing because she recognized, with the precision of a woman trained to find the thing hidden underneath the visible thing, that this was not about hair. But she straightened it once. Just once, for a dinner she already didn't want to attend. And the way Madame Yoon's eyes moved over her that evening, approving, told her everything about who had planted that particular seed. The suggestions kept coming. Her scrubs were unflattering. Her laugh was too loud for consortium gatherings. It drew attention in a way that wasn't useful. Her opinions at the table were offered with too much confidence for a room full of men who preferred their women decorative and deniable. Daehyun never said these things cruelly. That was almost worse. He said them the way you adjust a picture frame, casually, briefly, already moving on, as though the person inside the frame had no particular feelings about being straightened. She started editing herself in real time, catching her laugh before it fully escaped, wearing her hair the way Madame Yoon preferred, choosing silence over the opinion already forming in her throat. She told herself it was compromise. She told herself every marriage required translation. What she didn't tell herself, what she refused for a long time to name, was that she was disappearing. not being asked to change, being slowly, methodically erased, one small adjustment at a time, until the woman Daehyun had crossed a boardroom to find was barely visible inside the one he had sculpted in her place. And the worst part? She had handed him the chisel. Sarah didn't walk into rooms. She arrived in them. There was a difference. Nikisha noticed it the first night Daehyun brought her into the consortium's inner circle under the introduction of business associate. Sarah moved through space like she had already mapped it, already calculated every sightline, already decided who in the room was useful and who was furniture. She was the daughter of a senior official in Korea's shadow financial network, educated in Paris, fluent in 4 languages and the particular dialect of power that most people spend their entire lives trying to learn. She wore her ambition the way other women wore perfume. Present, intentional, impossible to ignore once you noticed it. She did not want Daehyun. Nikisha understood this immediately, which was why she did not feel threatened. That was her mistake. Sarah was infinitely more dangerous than a woman in love. She was a woman with a plan. The throne of the Black Dragon Consortium was the most powerful unelected position in Seoul's underworld economy. And it had a vulnerability. Its current occupant was emotionally tethered to a woman the old guard did not respect, a foreign wife with natural hair and no bloodline connections to the network. That tether was not a weakness Sarah intended to exploit romantically. It was a structural flaw she intended to widen until the whole foundation cracked. So she began. Carefully. Patiently. The way you work a fault line, not with force but with pressure applied at precisely the right point over precisely the right amount of time. Started with observations delivered as concern. Quiet words to Daehyun's most trusted lieutenant, who reported everything, about a man seen twice near the building where Nikisha worked late. Nothing alarming. Simply mentioned. The way you mention weather. Then a comment, almost offhand, about how remarkable Nikisha's independence was. Most wives in her position wouldn't keep working, wouldn't need to, but she clearly values her own world. Said with admiration. Meaning its opposite. Then came the question, asked only once but planted like a slow-release poison. Does she ever tell you what she's working on? Daehyun was a man who had built an empire on trusting his instincts about people. Sarah understood that his pride lived inside that instinct. So she didn't tell him what to think. She simply arranged the furniture of his suspicion and let him walk into it in the dark. By the time the whispers reached Daehyun directly, that Nikisha had been seen in private meetings, that her client list was unclear, that her loyalty to him specifically had never truly been tested, they no longer sounded like whispers. They sounded like evidence. Nikisha knew none of this. She was working late, building a life she believed they were building together, faithful in the way only someone completely in love can be faithful, without armor, without calculation, without ever imagining she needed to defend herself against a woman who had never once raised her voice. Sarah never needed to raise her voice. That was the whole point. She found out on a Thursday morning, alone in the bathroom of the apartment she still thought of as theirs. The test was the same brand she had bought 6 times before, always with the same careful hope, always with the same result. She had stopped telling Daehyun when she was testing. The early one she had shared with him, back when they still sat on the bathroom floor together waiting, his hand over hers, both of them pretending the disappointment didn't accumulate. But that version of him felt very far away now, and she had learned to protect herself from witnessing his relief when the result came back negative. So she was alone when the second line appeared. She sat with it for a long time. Just her and that thin pink line and the particular silence of a Thursday morning in Seoul. Then something moved through her chest, slow and enormous like a tide coming in, and she pressed both hands over her mouth and wept in a way she hadn't wept in years. and not from grief. From the sudden, overwhelming return of hope, she hadn't realized she'd given up. She was still composing herself when the OB guided the ultrasound wand across her abdomen 3 days later and went very still. Nikisha watched the technician's face before she watched the screen. She had learned to do that, read the person holding the information before the information arrived. The technician's expression moved through something Nikisha couldn't immediately name. Not concern. Something closer to careful astonishment. "Miss Salim," she said slowly, "I need you to look at the screen." Kisha looked. Four distinct shadows. 4 separate, impossible, luminous heartbeats pulsing on the monitor like small urgent lights. Technician pointed to each one in silence, letting the reality land in its own time. Kisha laughed. Came out of her before she could shape it into anything dignified, loud and full and completely uncontrolled. The laugh Dahyun had been quietly asking her to manage for the better part of a year. She didn't manage it. She let it fill the entire room. She called him from the parking lot, voice still unsteady, joy spilling through every word. She told him everything. 4 heartbeats, for babies, the technician's face, her own ridiculous laugh. She waited for his voice to crack open the way hers had. There was a pause. "I'll have the doctor's information sent to my assistant," Dahyun said. "We'll arrange the best care. Practical. Organized. Correct in every way that meant nothing." She sat in the car afterward and told herself it was shock. That he would call back when it settled. That the man who had once pressed his forehead against hers and whispered, "Whatever you need, I'm here," was still inside the one who had just responded to the miracle of 4 lives like it was a logistics problem to be managed. She waited for him to call back. He didn't. What he did instead, though she wouldn't learn this until much later, was relay the news to his mother. Madame Yoon received the information without expression. She excused herself from the room. She retrieved her private phone, the one connected to a number that appeared in no directory, no record, no document Nikisha would ever be hired to audit. She dialed. She spoke for less than 2 minutes. Then she returned to the room, folded her hands in her lap, and smiled the smile that never reached her eyes. Whatever she had set in motion, it was already moving. Her water broke at 3:14 in the morning. She was alone. Dahyun was in the study. She could hear the low murmur of his voice through the wall. Another call, another negotiation, another piece of the empire being quietly repositioned in the dark. She sat on the edge of the bed and breathed through the first contraction and decided not to knock on his door. She told herself it was because she didn't want to interrupt. The truth, which she was only beginning to let herself know, was that she already understood how the interruption would land, as inconvenience first, obligation second. She called Amara instead. Then she called the hospital. Then she put on her own shoes in the dark because her hands needed something to do. The next 22 hours were the longest of her life. Labor with multiples is not one experience. It is 4 separate battles running simultaneously inside a single body, each one demanding everything, none of them negotiating. The medical team was excellent. Focused, calm, moving around her with the practiced efficiency of people who understood the stakes. Nikisha held on to their steadiness when she had nothing else to hold on to. She breathed when they told her to breathe. She pushed when they told her to push. She stayed present through pain that rewrote her understanding of what her body could survive. Amara held her hand for most of it, saying very little, which was exactly right. The first baby arrived at 9:47 in the morning. Then the second. Then the third, each one announced by a cry that cut through the clinical noise of the delivery room like something ancient and necessary. Kisha wept between each one. Not from pain by then. From something bigger than pain. Fourth baby did not come easily. At hour 21, something shifted in the room, a change in the medical team's energy, subtle but absolute, the difference between managed urgency and genuine alarm. A hemorrhage. Numbers dropping on monitors that had been steady. More people entering the room. Voices clipped and precise. Someone's hand firm on her shoulder telling her to stay with them, stay present, stay here. She heard it distantly, stay here, and understood it was not a figure of speech. She stayed. By will and by fury and by the thought of 4 small faces she had not yet properly seen, she stayed. No one went to the waiting room to get Daehyun. Not during the hemorrhage. Not during the 40 minutes it took to stabilize her. Not during the quiet aftermath when Nikisha lay against the pillows with 3 babies on her chest and the 4th being rushed to the NICU and the room finally going still. A nurse found him eventually. Relayed the information in the corridor with the careful neutrality of someone delivering news to a man she could not read. He had been on his phone. He pocketed it. He straightened his tie, one clean, practiced motion, the reflex of a man who regulated his exterior when his interior was too complicated to examine. Then he walked through the door. Nikisha watched him cross the room toward her. She noted the tie. She noted the absence of 22 hours in his face. No exhaustion, no evidence of fear, no sign that the night had cost him anything at all. She looked down at her babies. She didn't look up again. She did not sign the DNA release form Daehyun's attorney slid onto her bedside table the morning after the denial. She did not sign the consortium's private non-disclosure agreement that arrived 2 hours later in a different envelope from a different attorney. She did not sign anything. She simply looked at each document with the focused, unhurried attention of a woman who had spent her career understanding exactly what signatures meant and what they cost, and then she set them aside. She said nothing to Daehyun, nothing to Madame Yoon, nothing to Sarah, who had the particular audacity to appear in the corridor outside her room on the second day wearing concern like a costume. Nikisha had learned, across 3 years in the world of the Black Dragon Consortium, that the most powerful thing a woman could do in a room full of people waiting for her to break was to give them absolute silence. Not cold silence. Not performative silence. Just the silence of a person who has already made a decision and sees no reason to announce it. She called Amara instead. Within 72 hours, she was gone. Amara had always been the logistics of Nikisha's life, the person who knew which documents lived where, which accounts were solely in Nikisha's name, which of her professional contacts existed entirely outside the consortium's reach. She arrived at the hospital with a bag packed from the apartment while Daehyun was attending a consortium meeting he had apparently decided could not wait. She signed the discharge paperwork as emergency contact. She arranged the car, the driver, and the first month's payment on a flat in a quiet district of Busan where no one knew either of their names. The 4th baby, the smallest, the fighter, was discharged from the NICU on the morning they left. Nikisha carried her out herself. The flat had 2 bedrooms, thin walls, and a kitchen window that faced another building's kitchen window. It was nothing like the apartment in Seoul. It was the first space in 3 years that belonged entirely to her. The nights were extraordinary in their difficulty. For infants do not sleep in coordination, they sleep in rotation, which means a mother of 4 does not sleep at all, not really, only moves between states of exhaustion separated by brief intervals of something adjacent to rest. Keisha learned to function in those intervals. Learn to eat standing up, to shower in 4 minutes, to hold 2 babies simultaneously while warming bottles with the efficiency of someone running a very small, very demanding operation. Amara stayed for the first month. Then work called her back, and Nikisha told her to go and meant it. She was alone with 4 infants and a silence that could have swallowed her whole. Instead, every night after the last feeding, after 4 small chests rose and fell in the particular rhythm of newborn sleep, she opened her laptop. Not to distract herself. Not to escape. 'Cause Nikisha Salim had spent 3 years building someone else's world and she was done with that now. She had a different architecture in mind. And the consortium's financial records, every irregularity she had ever quietly noted, every buried account, every ghost signature, were still living in the precise, unforgiving archive of her memory. She began to work. Quietly. Methodically. The way you dismantle something enormous, not with fury but with patience and the right tools and all the time in the world. The email arrived on a Tuesday night between the 2nd and 3rd feeding. The sender was a Dr. Lena Park, forensic geneticist, formerly of Seoul National University's Molecular Biology Department, currently operating a private consultation practice that served, among other clients, several of Korea's more discreet legal firms. The subject line contained nothing alarming. Just a case reference number and 4 words. Please call me directly. Keisha recognized the case number. It was the DNA test Daehyun had ordered. The one stamped across that manila folder. The one meant to humiliate her in a hospital room in front of his mother and his lieutenant's fiancé and whatever remained of her dignity. She put down the bottle she was holding. She read the email 3 times. Then she called. Dr. Park's voice was careful in the way that careful people get when they are holding information that frightens them. She confirmed the primary result first, clearly, unambiguously, with the precision of someone who understood that this particular finding needed no interpretation. Quadruplets were Daehyun's. All 4. The genetic match was absolute, the kind of result that left no corridor for doubt or argument or the particular brand of motivated disbelief that powerful men sometimes brought to inconvenient facts. Then why are you calling me privately? Keisha asked. A pause. The kind that meant the next thing was the real thing. 'Cause the test returned something else, Dr. Park said. Something I don't believe the consortium's in-house team has fully processed yet. Or if they have, someone has made a decision to keep it very quiet. What the genetic markers revealed, when examined with the thoroughness that Daehyun's own demand for certainty had accidentally required, was a paternal lineage that did not match the bloodline of the man whose name was carved into the founding documents of the Black Dragon Consortium. The man Daehyun had built his entire identity upon. The father whose legend he had inherited, whose throne he had ascended, whose name gave him the authority that every lieutenant, every rival, every terrified associate had spent years deferring to. That man was not Daehyun's biological father. The actual markers pointed elsewhere, to a genetic profile that Dr. Park, with the networked knowledge of someone who had processed DNA for Seoul's underworld-adjacent legal cases for 15 years, recognized with quiet certainty. A profile belonging to the founding bloodline of the Changhua faction, the Black Dragon Consortium's oldest rival. Madame Yoon had not made one mistake 30-something years ago. She had made a choice. A passionate, catastrophic, carefully buried choice, and then she had spent 3 decades constructing a life, a marriage, a dynasty, and a son's entire sense of self on top of the grave she had dug for it. Nikisha sat in the dark of the Busan flat for a long time after the call ended. Around her, 4 babies breathed in their small synchronized rhythms, unknowing and perfect. She thought about Daehyun. Not with cruelty. With something almost like grief, for the man who had no idea that the empire he had bled for, the legitimacy he had weaponized against her, the throne he had chosen over his own children, was built entirely on a lie his mother had told before he was born. Then she opened her laptop. The information Dr. Park had just given her was not a weapon she had sought. But Nikisha Salim had spent her entire career understanding the difference between information and leverage, and she understood with complete clarity that what she now held was the most dangerous combination of both that Seoul's underworld had ever unknowingly produced. She began to type. She gave Amara 2 instructions before she boarded the train back to Seoul. The first, make sure the children were settled, fed, and would not need her before morning. The second, if Nikisha was not back within 48 hours, open the secondary drive and follow the instructions inside. Amara had looked at her for a long moment, reading her the way only someone who had known her for 20 years could read her, and then nodded without asking questions. That was the thing about Amara. She always understood when the time for questions had passed. Nikisha wore a suit the color of midnight. She had bought it 3 weeks earlier in a Busan boutique, tried it on once and hung it on the back of the door where she could see it every morning while she worked. Not as vanity, as intention, as the daily reminder of where all of it was going. She took a car from the station. She did not tell anyone she was coming. The Black Dragon Consortium's board met in a glass-walled conference room on the 34th floor of a building that technically belonged to an architecture firm that technically belonged to a holding company that technically belonged to no one findable. Nikisha had traced its actual ownership in her second week in Busan, which had taken her approximately 4 hours and confirmed everything she already suspected about how Daehyun's lieutenants had been quietly positioning themselves while his attention was fractured. She had requested the meeting through an intermediary, a legal firm known to the board as representing an anonymous overseas investor who had, over the past several months, acquired significant stakes in 7 of the consortium's offshore holdings. The board had agreed immediately. Anonymous overseas investors with that kind of reach did not get kept waiting. They did not know who she was until she walked through the door. The room went very still. Daehyun was at the head of the table. He looked exactly as he always looked, controlled, impeccable, the particular blankness of a man who had trained himself never to show first reaction. But she watched his eyes move across her face and she saw it. The single unguarded second before the mask reassembled. Shock. Then something she didn't have time to name. She set 4 folders on the table, one in front of each of the senior board members. Then she sat down, folded her hands, and waited while they opened them. The folders contained everything. The offshore restructuring, every account rerouted, every asset repositioned, every escape hatch she had built over 6 months of meticulous invisible work. The evidence of 2 decades of fraud and money laundering, documented with the forensic precision of someone who understood exactly how to make financial evidence irrefutable in any jurisdiction on Earth. And at the back of each folder on a single clean page, the identity of the anonymous architect who had designed the entire operation. Her name, her signature, her handwriting, which Daehyun had seen across 3 years of shared life, grocery lists, audit notes, the letter she had left on his desk the morning she first told him she loved him. He recognized it immediately. She watched him recognize it. Watched the full weight of what she had done, not in anger, not in desperation, but in patient and absolute deliberateness, land across his face like a verdict. She said only one thing before the room erupted. 4 folders, Nikisha said quietly. 1 for each child you denied. Madame Yoon's secret did not explode. Dissolved. That was somehow worse. An explosion is an event, contained, survivable, something you can point to and say that is where it happened. What occurred instead was a slow, total saturation. The genetic information moved through Seoul's underworld the way water moves through stone, quietly, without announcement, finding every crack until the structure that had looked solid from the outside simply stopped holding. Within 3 weeks of the board meeting, every faction that had deferred to the Black Dragon Consortium's founding bloodline understood that the bloodline was fiction. that the throne had been built on a secret a woman had carried for 30 years and nearly carried to her grave. Madame Yun made no public statement. She retreated to the family house and closed every curtain and did not receive visitors. Whatever she felt inside those rooms, guilt, fury, the particular devastation of a lie finally outliving the liar's ability to contain it, she kept it where she had always kept everything that mattered. Completely to herself. It was, in its way, the most consistent thing about her. Sarah lasted slightly longer. She was resourceful and she was intelligent and she had contingency plans for her contingency plans. But contingency plans require a power structure to attach to, and the one she had spent years carefully climbing had been quietly, methodically liquidated by a forensic accountant in a midnight suit who had done her homework in a rented flat in Busan between night feedings. Without the consortium's architecture beneath her, Sarah's connections were decorative. Her influence evaporated with a speed that would have been almost impressive if it weren't so perfectly deserved. Dae-hyun stood at the gate of the house in Yongsan on a Thursday afternoon in late autumn. It was his name on the original deed. It was also, as of 30 days prior, no longer his house, transferred as part of the legal settlement that Nikisha's attorneys had executed with the same quiet precision she brought to everything. He stood at the gate anyway. She didn't know if it was habit or grief or something he couldn't name any better than she could name it for him. She did not open the door. She sent a letter through her attorney instead. 3 sentences. She had written it in under a minute because she had known for a long time exactly what she wanted to say and exactly how much space it deserved. Children know your name. That is your inheritance. Use it wisely. The house Nikisha bought was full of noise. That was the first thing anyone noticed upon entering it. The density of sound, the particular beautiful chaos of 4 small people existing at full volume in a space built to hold them. Light came through every window. There were handprints on things that should not have had handprints on them. There was always something on the stove and always someone demanding to be carried, and always, underneath all of it, the steady, unhurried presence of a woman who had survived the worst thing anyone had done to her and come out the other side not hardened but clarified. Nikisha Salim never looked back. She never needed to. Everything worth keeping was already in front of her, loud and luminous and entirely unapologetically hers. Thank you for watching this story till the end. Please subscribe to this channel for more amazing and intriguing stories like this. Thanks.